the fabric still carrying her mother's scent. The groom, a Norse jarl who had personally separated her father's head from his body, made jokes with his warriors about taming the Irish mare. They wagered on how long before she stopped fighting. Some gave her a week. Others, who had seen this process before, knew it would take months or years. The complete breaking of a noble woman required patience and systematic destruction of every source of identity and resistance. This systematic practice followed predictable patterns across the Viking world: kill the men of fighting age, enslave the servants and common women. But the daughters of nobility faced a different fate. They became wives to their conquerors, their bodies serving as bridges between destroyed kingdoms and new Viking territories. These marriages were not unions, but absorptions, designed to eliminate rival bloodlines while maintaining legal claims to conquered lands. By marrying noble daughters, Viking conquerors gained legitimate claims that pure conquest could never provide. Local populations might resist foreign invaders, but found it harder to resist the children of their own noble bloodlines, even when those children were raised to despise their maternal heritage. 3 documented patterns from this period illustrate the system's consistency. In Scotland, a Mormaer's daughter was married to the Viking who strangled her father. She bore him 4 sons who grew up to lead raids against their mother's people, spending 30 years as wife to her father's killer. In Francia, a widow was forced to marry her husband's killer within a month, the Viking leader needing her to maintain control over her late husband's estates, while her children from her first marriage were reduced to thralls in their own former home. In Saxony, a princess was wed to the Viking who had burned her city after ordering the execution of 300 citizens who refused to submit at their wedding. He wore armor, still marked with soot from the burning. These forced marriages created children who embodied conquest. They looked like their defeated mothers, but thought like their Viking fathers. They spoke Norse, primarily, learning their mothers' languages only as useful tools for managing subjected populations. They worshipped Norse gods, while their mothers secretly prayed to Christ. Modern Icelandic genetic research reveals the lasting impact. While male lineage is predominantly Norse, approximately 80% Scandinavian. Female lineage is heavily Celtic, 62-63% Irish and Scottish. These statistics represent thousands of women whose bodies became the vessels through which Viking expansion achieved permanent genetic conquest. The numbers are preserved in DNA of living populations. Every person of Icelandic descent likely carries genetic markers from both Norse conquerors and their Celtic captives, embodying in their cells the history that written records tried to minimize. But the genetic evidence extends beyond Iceland. Studies across Scandinavian populations show similar patterns of Norse male lineage, combined with significant percentages of British Isles and Slavic female lineage, confirming that Viking expansion relied fundamentally on systematic abduction and forced reproduction rather than consensual migration. Archaeological evidence supports the written and genetic records. Excavations at Dublin have uncovered remains of the massive slave market infrastructure, iron shackles, holding pen foundations, mass graves containing bodies showing signs of malnutrition and trauma. At Hedeby in Denmark, another major trading center. Similar evidence confirms the industrial scale of human trafficking operations. Ship burials across Scandinavia repeatedly reveal female bodies positioned as servants beside male primary occupants, often showing signs of violent death, matching methods described in sources like Ibn Fadlan's account. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, excavated 1904, contained 2 female bodies, one elderly, probably the primary occupant. and one younger with a broken collarbone consistent with strangulation. The Ballataire burial on the Isle of Man, excavated 1946, contained a male skeleton buried with weapons and a female skeleton with the top of her skull sliced off by a sword blow she had been kneeling when struck, positioned at the man's feet as an eternal servant. Volga River, spring 922 CE. We return now to where we began, the unnamed girl in the tent on the funeral ship. Ibn Fadlan's account provides the most detailed eyewitness description of human sacrifice from the Viking Age. And understanding what happened to this girl requires examining his testimony with precision. For 10 days after the chieftain's death, she had been kept in a suspended state between life and death. She was given strong drink, constantly fermented mare's milk mixed with herbs that cause mild hallucinations, keeping her intoxicated but conscious, present but not entirely there. She was dressed in fine clothes and treated as someone sacred and doomed simultaneously. Each day, she was lifted onto a platform where she proclaimed visions of the afterlife. "I see my master, he calls me to his hall." But the 10-day preparation included elements Ibn Fadlan described with evident discomfort. Each night, different men from the chieftain's inner circle visited her tent. Each would lie with her while attendants held her, then speak ritual words. "Tell your master I did this out of love for him." This continued for 10 consecutive nights. Different men, same ritual, formula that transformed what was happening into supposed devotion to the dead chieftain rather than use of the girl's body. She was carrying messages to the afterlife. The ritual insisted. Each encounter a message of loyalty she would deliver when she joined her master. On the 10th day, the final ceremony began. She was brought to the funeral ship where the chieftain's body lay prepared in a tent. 6 warriors, relatives of the dead man, entered the tent with her. Outside, the remaining Rus began beating their shields with sticks, creating thunderous noise. Ibn Fadlan asked his interpreter why. The answer was chilling, so that the other slave girls will not hear her screams. If they hear what is happening inside the tent, none of them will ever volunteer to die with their masters again. Inside the tent, the 6 men completed their ritual one final time. Then, they positioned her beside the chieftain's corpse. 2 men held her feet. 2 held her hands, while 2 others held the ends of a rope wrapped around her neck, pulling it tight from both sides. At the same moment, the old woman called the Angel of Death entered with a broad-bladed dagger and began stabbing her repeatedly between the ribs. The execution method required both strangulation and stabbing simultaneously. The rope compressed the carotid arteries, cutting off blood flow to the brain and causing unconsciousness within 8 to 12 seconds. But strangulation alone might take several minutes to kill, and the victim could potentially revive if pressure was released. The stabbing ensured no revival was possible. The broad blade pierced the intercostal spaces between ribs repeatedly, puncturing both lungs and causing massive internal hemorrhaging. Each thrust created hemothorax, blood filling the pleural cavity surrounding the lungs, making breathing impossible even if the rope were removed. The combination was methodical. The rope brought unconsciousness quickly. The blade brought death completely. When it was over, her body was positioned beside her master's in a posture of service. The tent was sealed. Fire arrows ignited the oil-soaked wood. Within minutes, the entire ship blazed. The Rus crowd cheered as smoke rose, carrying their chieftain and his slave to the afterlife. By sunset, only ashes remained. But this girl was one of thousands who died in similar ceremonies across the Viking world. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described witnessing a ceremony in Sweden where 5 women were burned with a king. Archaeological evidence confirms multiple female bodies in ship burials across Scandinavia. Their positions suggesting they did not die naturally, yet funeral sacrifices, for all their horror, ended quickly. Most enslaved women faced decades of servitude under legal systems designed to make escape impossible and freedom unattainable. Iceland's geography created unique psychological torments. The island itself was a prison more secure than any walls. Escape meant death by ocean, volcano, or ice. The interior was uninhabitable volcanic desert. The coasts were rocky cliffs beaten by violent seas. Summer brought continuous daylight that made concealment impossible. Winter brought darkness and cold that killed in hours. Women who attempted escape faced certain death, and that certainty created specific psychological patterns, higher rates of complete dissociation, elaborate fantasy worlds as internal escapes when external escape was impossible. Some becoming catatonic while their bodies continued working. Resistance took many forms, despite the impossibility of escape. Poisoning was the most common tool. Women who prepared food had access to kitchens, gardens, and brewing supplies. They learned which local plants caused illness versus death. Some engaged in slow poisoning that appeared to be natural disease. An Irish woman named in sources killed 3 masters over 5 years using small doses of mercury from metalwork before being caught. Arson provided another avenue. A coordinated group burned Hedebe's slave market in 943, destroying not just slave pens, but significant portions of the trading post. 17 of 20 women involved died in the flames they set, choosing immolation over recapture. Infanticide, devastating to mothers, but seen as mercy compared to condemning children to slavery, occurred regularly. Women would smother newborns rather than watch another generation enslaved. Norse law treated this as property destruction. But no punishment could be worse than what drove mothers to kill their own children. Some women seduced Viking men specifically to kill them, earning trust through apparent submission, gaining access to private spaces, then striking when victims were most vulnerable. The price for resistance was severe. The Blood Eagle execution was sometimes used for women who killed masters, and mass executions of uninvolved slaves would follow individual acts of resistance. But resistance continued because for many women, death with defiance seemed preferable to life without dignity. The unnamed girl on the Volga River died in spring 922 CE. She was approximately 19 years old. She had been enslaved for 2 years. She was one of an estimated 500 to uno. Ling, ling, ling. 000 women captured during the Viking Age. Her story survives because Ahmad ibn Fadlan happened to be present and happened to write down what he saw. Without his testimony, she would be one of countless anonymous sacrifices. Modern DNA studies reveal the genetic shadow of this massive forced migration Iceland literally built on stolen women. Scandinavian populations carrying Celtic and Slavic maternal lineages as permanent evidence of systematic abduction. Subscribe to Medieval Survival Skills for more documented historical reality. We're revealing what actually happened behind the legends.